It was March of 1943, and the Pacific Ocean seemed endless. To the men fighting there, the horizon was both a promise of hope and a reminder of isolation. Convoys of Japanese transports slid across those waters like shadows, carrying thousands of troops to reinforce strongholds in New Guinea. And for the Allied soldiers clinging to every patch of contested ground, each convoy meant one thing: more enemy soldiers, more supplies, more battles they could not afford to lose. At that time, America was still reeling from disaster. Pearl Harbor, the fall of the Philippines, Wake Island, all bitter reminders that the Japanese war machine looked unstoppable. The men of General Douglas MacArthur's 5th Air Force faced the impossible task of stopping enemy convoys with weapons designed for a different kind of war. Bombers flew high, so high their crews could barely see the targets below. At 20,000 feet, they dropped bombs that whistled for miles before striking the ocean more often than not, miles away from any ship. The Japanese simply adjusted their rudders, zigzagging through the spray, and continued toward their destinations. For every convoy that slipped through, Allied soldiers braced for the reinforcements that followed. But in the shadows of maintenance hangars and makeshift workshops, a different kind of war was beginning. Not fought with fleets or vast budgets, but with salvaged parts, sleepless mechanics, and one man's refusal to accept defeat. His name was Paul Pappy Gunn, a 6th-grade dropout from Arkansas, a mechanic-turned-pilot, a man who had already lost almost everything to the war. His family was imprisoned in Manila. His airline, his home, his peace, all gone. And in that loss, something burned inside him, a determination that if he couldn't bring his family back, he could at least take the fight to the enemy with every ounce of ingenuity he possessed. Gunn looked at the problem with a mechanic's eye. If bombs from above couldn't sink ships, then perhaps guns at sea level could. He imagined a bomber not as a fragile, high-flying precision weapon, but as a predator flying so low that its shadow rippled across the waves. A bomber that bristled with heavy machine guns, capable of tearing into enemy decks and dropping bombs so close that ships had no chance to turn away. It was an idea born not in the war rooms of generals, but in the grease-stained workshops of men who were tired of losing. It was a gamble that broke every rule in the book, and it was about to change the Pacific War forever. This is the story of how a mechanic from Arkansas rewrote the very rules of air combat. The story of the 8-gun nose, a desperate innovation that turned the B-25 Mitchell from a medium bomber into a ship killer, and how, in the space of just 15 minutes over the Bismar Sea, Japan learned that America would never again fight the same war. If you want us to keep uncovering the hidden stories of World War II, make sure to subscribe to Echoes of World War II. Your support helps us continue the journey. 1. The Desperate Pacific, 1942-43. In the early months of 1942, the Pacific seemed like a vast empire that belonged entirely to Japan. Pearl Harbor still burned in memory, the Philippines had fallen, and Wake Island, once proudly defended, was now a Japanese outpost. Across the maps hanging in Allied war rooms, the red rising sun flag spread like an unstoppable tide, covering islands, airfields, and harbors that only months earlier had been free. For the men of General Douglas MacArthur's forces in the Southwest Pacific, survival itself was a daily miracle. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outsupplied. Every Japanese convoy that crossed the Bismar Sea carried fresh troops, artillery, and food to reinforce garrisons in New Guinea, directly threatening the thin line of Allied soldiers trying to hold them back. To those on the ground, each convoy meant new battles and longer odds. The Allies, of course, fought back. B-17 flying fortresses soared high into the sky, their crews peering through bomb sights at the tiny grey specks of ships far below. From 4 miles up, they released their payloads, praying that gravity, luck, and mathematics would guide the bombs to their targets. But the Pacific was unforgiving. A destroyer's captain needed only a slight turn of the wheel to send tons of explosives crashing harmlessly into the sea. In one raid, American bombers dropped dozens of bombs on a convoy bound for Leh. Out of all those tons of steel and TNT, only a single near miss was recorded. The Japanese ships carried on, their wakes foaming confidently across the ocean, as though mocking the bombers above. For the weary air crews returning to base, the truth was painful. Courage and effort were not enough. The tactics they were using belonged to another kind of war. Here lies the first great lesson of the Pacific. Bravery without adaptation achieves little. No matter how skilled or determined, fighting with the wrong tools and the wrong ideas leads only to frustration. But not everyone was content to repeat the same failures. In the hangars and dusty workshops of northern Australia, a few men were already asking dangerous questions. What if bombers didn't have to fly high? What if they could fight ships on their own terms down low, where every bullet and every bomb truly mattered? And leading this quiet rebellion of thought was a man few generals had ever heard of, a mechanic-turned-pilot from Arkansas, who had already lost nearly everything to the war. His name was Pappy Gunn, and his story would prove that sometimes the most important weapons are born not in the minds of strategists, but in the hands of men who refuse to give up. 2. A mechanic with nothing left to lose. The story of Pappy Gunn. Paul Irving, Pappy Gunn, never looked like the kind of man destined to change the course of a world war. Born in a small Arkansas town in 1899, he left school after the 6th grade. He wasn't a scholar, nor the polished kind of officer whose name usually fills history books. What he had, instead, was grit and a love for machines. As a teenager, he joined the Navy, not with dreams of glory, but with the simple hope of flying. Regulations said only college-educated officers could become pilots. Paul had neither. So he worked his way in the only way possible, as an aviation mechanic. Day after day, he studied the engines, wings, and controls of every aircraft he touched. He learned not just how to fix planes, but how to coax the most out of them, how to turn broken parts into second chances. Eventually, he saved enough money to buy a surplus seaplane. Without instructors, without classrooms, he taught himself to fly. By the time America entered World War II, Gunn was already something of a legend within Navy circles. He was one of the rare naval aviation pilots enlisted men allowed to fly because of their skill, not their pedigree. He had flown from the decks of the USS Langley, Lexington, and Saratoga, learning firsthand the art of improvisation at sea. But when the Navy finally offered him an officer's commission, Gunn was already 40 years old and ready for a different chapter of life. He retired, moved to the Philippines, and started something new. Philippine Airlines. With just 4 red Beechcraft aircraft, he carried passengers between islands, building a small business with his wife Polly and their children. For the first time, life was peaceful. Then came the 7th of December, 1941. The Japanese invasion shattered everything. Manila fell. His family was captured and interned in the Santo Tomas camp. His home and airline were seized. Gunn himself barely escaped with his life, making it to Australia with other evacuees. In the ashes of loss, something hardened inside him. The Japanese had taken his livelihood, his freedom, and even his family. But they had also unleashed a dangerous kind of resolve. Gunn was no longer a businessman. He was a man with nothing left to lose and a lifetime of mechanical genius at his fingertips. When the U.S. Army Air Forces commissioned him as a captain, they thought they were getting another pilot. What they got was an inventor at war, a man determined to make every aircraft a more lethal weapon against the enemy that had taken so much from him. Here lies another lesson of the Pacific War. Innovation often comes from those pushed to the edge. When you strip away comfort, titles, and protocol, you find out who is willing to imagine new solutions. Gunn was exactly that kind of man. And soon he would turn his grief into something the Japanese had never seen before. The question was simple. If bombs from 20,000 feet couldn't sink ships, what could? 3. Rethinking warfare. Why high? Altitude bombing didn't work. When Pappy Gunn arrived in Australia in 1942, he walked into a war being fought with the wrong tools. American air doctrine, shaped in the interwar years, had promised that fleets of heavy bombers at high altitude could cripple an enemy's industry and choke off supply lines. In Europe, where bombers targeted factories, oil refineries, and railroads, the theory had merit. But in the Pacific, it was a different world. Here the targets weren't sprawling cities or industrial centers. They were ships fast, maneuverable, and very much alive. Trying to hit them from 20,000 feet was like dropping a stone from the top of a skyscraper and hoping it would land on a speeding car below. The math, quite literally, was against the Allies. A Japanese destroyer moving at 25 knots could change direction in the time it took a bomb to fall. Even the most perfectly aimed drop often ended with geysers of seawater exploding harmlessly behind a ship's stern. In early raids, B-17 crews released hundreds of bombs, only to return with nothing to show for it but film footage of near misses. The Japanese, confident in their convoy doctrine, knew this. They trained their captains to zigzag as soon as bombers appeared. They placed anti-aircraft crews in overlapping arcs of fire, ready to punish any aircraft foolish enough to dive lower. To them, American bombing raids felt more like a nuisance than a real threat. Convoys reached their destinations, troops unloaded, supplies delivered. The war machine rolled on. For the men flying those missions, frustration cut deep. Imagine standing at the window of a bomber, watching your bombs drift gracefully into the ocean, while Japanese ships sailed forward untouched. Imagine knowing that your effort, your courage, your risk of being shot out of the sky had amounted to nothing. One airman later wrote, "It was like trying to swat a mosquito with a baseball bat. You swung hard, but the target was already gone." Here's the lesson that echoed in those lost months. Tactics built for yesterday's war cannot win today's battles. The Pacific demanded new thinking, something more direct, more brutal, and far more dangerous. And it was in this space of frustration, with bombs failing and convoys surviving, that Pappy Gunn's imagination took flight. He looked at the B-25 Mitchell not as a high-altitude bomber, but as raw potential, a machine that could be reshaped, stripped down, and reborn as something entirely new. The question was no longer how to drop bombs more accurately from above. The question became, how close are you willing to fly to make sure they hit? 4. Building the flying gunship. Pappy Gunn was not the sort of man who accepted impossible. When he looked at the B-25 Mitchell bomber, he didn't see a polished machine meant for textbook bombing runs. He saw a blank canvas. To him, every panel, every empty compartment, every unused inch of space was an opportunity. The first step was simple in concept, but radical in practice. Remove what wasn't working. Out went the bombardier's equipment and delicate sighting systems tools built for high-altitude precision that simply didn't work against ships. In their place, Gunn and his team installed 50-caliber Browning machine guns, salvaged from wrecked fighters that would never fly again. At first there were 4, then 6, and finally, the now legendary 8-gun nose. Each modification had to be invented from scratch. Where would the ammunition be stored? How would the recoil be absorbed without tearing the nose apart? How could pilots still see well enough to aim while staring down a cluster of guns? These were not problems solved by blueprints or instruction manuals. They were solved by welders, wrenches, and trial and error in sweltering hangars. One mechanic recalled long nights under the harsh glow of lanterns, bolting machine guns into place and feeding belts of ammunition through improvised chutes. There was no official order, no approval from Washington, only the quiet determination of men who believed that if they didn't innovate, they would keep losing friends to Japanese convoys. The result was startling. In test flights, the modified B-25 seconds could unleash a hurricane of firepower. 8 machine guns firing forward meant more concentrated bullets than 3 P-51 Mustang fighters combined. A single pass from nose to stern could sweep the decks of a ship clean, shredding anti-aircraft crews before they had time to return fire. But the guns were only half the idea. To truly kill ships, bombs had to hit, and that meant flying lower, closer, and braver than ever before. This led to a second innovation: skip bombing. Instead of dropping bombs from miles above, pilots would release them just 50 feet off the water, letting them skip across the waves like a child's stone on a pond before slamming into a ship's side. It was dangerous. It was unorthodox. It was everything conventional doctrine warned against. Yet it was exactly what the Pacific War demanded. Here lies the lesson. True innovation is rarely comfortable. It doesn't come from following manuals. It comes from breaking them. And sometimes, the only way forward is to risk everything on an idea no one else dares to try. By the end of 1942, squadrons of modified B-25 seconds were ready. They weren't sleek, they weren't pretty, but they were deadly. And soon, they would test their new fangs in the unforgiving waters of the Pacific. The next challenge was teaching pilots how to wield this new weapon, flying so low they could feel the salt spray, threading between enemy ships at mast height, and releasing bombs with split-second timing. This was not just engineering anymore. This was a revolution in tactics. 5. Skip bombing. Turning bombs into skipping stones. Imagine flying just 50 feet above the Pacific, waves whipping so close beneath you that the spray sometimes splattered across the cockpit glass. Your bomber is hurtling forward at 250 miles per hour, every gun on the deck of a Japanese destroyer pointed at you, tracers rising like red-hot needles in the sky. And in that moment, you have to release your bomb with perfect timing, not too early, not too late, so it skips across the water like a flat stone on a pond and slams into the steel hull of the ship ahead. This was skip bombing, and it was as terrifying as it was ingenious. The principle was beautifully simple. Drop a 500-pound bomb at low altitude and high speed, and the bomb would bounce across the waves before striking a ship's side just at or below the waterline, the weakest point of any vessel. Unlike torpedoes, which were slow and unreliable, skip bombs arrived too quickly for ships to evade. Unlike high-altitude bombs, these couldn't be dodged with a last-second turn. Once the bomb skipped toward you, it was already too late. But mastering the technique was anything but simple. Pilots had to approach targets almost at mast height, exposed to every gun the enemy could fire. Training missions were littered with mistakes, bombs that sank too soon, detonations that sent shockwaves back toward the aircraft, and crashes from crews who simply flew too low. For every successful practice run, there were moments of sheer terror. One American pilot later recalled, "Your hands were slick with sweat, the altimeter practically useless that close to the water. It was just you, the ship, and the hope that your bomb would bounce instead of sink." To increase survival, tactics evolved. Bowfighter aircraft would sweep in first, raking ships with cannon fire to keep anti-aircraft gunners' heads down. Then, the modified B-25 seconds roared in, their 8-gun noses blazing, clearing decks of defenders before dropping their skip bombs. It was teamwork born out of necessity, one wave suppressing, the next wave striking the killing blow. Here lies the lesson. Innovation in war isn't only about machines, it's about how people learn to use them together. A weapon is powerful, but a tactic turns it into victory. By early 1943, skip bombing was no longer just an experiment. It was a perfected art, ready to be unleashed in combat. And soon, the Japanese would discover that their convoy doctrine, once so reliable, so confident, was suddenly obsolete. Because on the horizon loomed the Battle of the Bismar Sea, where everything Pappy Gunn and his fellow innovators had built would be put to the ultimate test. 6. American improvisation versus Japanese rigidity. The Pacific War was not just a clash of fleets and air wings, it was a clash of philosophies. Nowhere was this more evident than in the skies above New Guinea. The Japanese had built their military doctrine over decades, drilling discipline, precision, and obedience into every level of command. Their captains were trained to follow escort procedures to the letter. Destroyers formed protective screens, anti-aircraft gunners practiced firing patterns, and convoys zigzagged exactly as the manuals prescribed. To them, warfare was like a ritual dance, each step rehearsed, each move perfected long before the battle began. For a time, it worked. Against high-altitude bombing, Japanese convoys seemed untouchable. Every raid ended the same way, bombs splashing harmlessly into the sea while ships carried on. Japanese officers grew confident, even complacent, believing they had solved the problem of Allied air attacks. But improvisation was not in their playbook. When the Americans suddenly came in, low-skimming the waves, guns blazing, bombs skipping across the water, the Japanese had no doctrine, no counter, no plan. Their well-rehearsed steps fell apart in seconds. The Americans, by contrast, thrived on adaptation. Mechanics scavenged parts from wrecked planes, pilots experimented with daring approaches, commanders like General George Kenney encouraged field modifications instead of punishing them. Innovation was not just tolerated, it was celebrated. Pappy Gunn was the perfect symbol of this mindset, a man who ignored manuals, broke rules, and turned a medium bomber into something entirely new. This cultural contrast mattered. The Japanese valued perfection, the Americans valued flexibility. And in war, flexibility often wins. One Japanese survivor later recalled the first time he saw B-25 seconds roaring in at mast height. "We had trained for bombers above us, never for this. They came like wolves, spitting fire. We did not know how to answer." Here lies the lesson. Doctrine can prepare you for yesterday's battle, but only imagination prepares you for tomorrow's. The Japanese had perfected their defense against the wrong threat. The Americans had invented the right one. And in March of 1943, this difference would be put to the ultimate test. For across the Bismar Sea, a convoy of 8 transports and 8 destroyers was steaming toward Leh, carrying nearly 7,000 troops. To the Japanese, it was just another routine run. To the Allies, it was the chance to unleash their new tactics in full for the very first time. 7. The Battle of the Bismar Sea, blow by blow. On March 3, 1943, dawn broke over the Bismar Sea. The waters shimmered with the wakes of a powerful Japanese convoy. 8 transports packed with nearly 7,000 soldiers, escorted by 8 destroyers. To Tokyo, this was routine, a lifeline carrying fresh troops to New Guinea, meant to crush Allied resistance once and for all. To the men of the 5th Air Force, it was the opportunity they had been waiting for. At 10:15 a.m., the first American formations appeared. B-17 flying fortresses, flying high, began their attack. Their bombs fell from the sky like iron rain, forcing the Japanese ships to scatter, zigzagging violently. Few hits were scored, but that wasn't the point. The high-altitude attack was a feint, a distraction. It kept the convoy disorganized, just long enough for the real strike to arrive. Moments later, Australian bowfighters swept in at mast height. With their cannons roaring, they strafed the decks, silencing anti-aircraft crews and forcing Japanese sailors to dive for cover. Flames erupted on several transports. Smoke billowed. Confusion spread. And then, just behind them, came the Americans' new weapon. 13 B-25 Mitchells, their noses bristling with 8 heavy machine guns each, tore across the waves. From the Japanese decks, they must have seemed like flying fortresses of fire. In perfect formation, the gunships opened up. Streams of .50 caliber bullets stitched across the ships, mowing down gunners, ripping apart equipment, sweeping the decks clean. In the roar of engines and gunfire, the convoy's defenses collapsed. Then came the bombs. Flying so low they could see sailors scrambling across the decks, the pilots released their 500-pounders. The bombs skipped once, twice across the surface and slammed into hulls with devastating force. One transport exploded in a plume of smoke and fire. Another was torn nearly in half. A destroyer lurched, burning fiercely, before slipping beneath the waves. The battle lasted only minutes, but to the men fighting, it felt eternal. Japanese sailors screamed orders, scrambled to return fire, tried desperately to maneuver, but nothing worked. The convoy, once confident and disciplined, dissolved into chaos. By the end of the attack, 8 transports and 4 destroyers were sinking or aflame. The sea itself seemed to boil with wreckage, lifeboats, and oil slicks. Of the nearly 7,000 Japanese troops who had set out, fewer than 1,200 would ever reach their destination. The rest were dead, wounded, or stranded on the open ocean. American losses were minimal. The gamble had paid off. In less than a quarter of an hour, Pappy Gunn's 8-gun nose and the tactic of skip bombing had rewritten the rules of naval warfare. One pilot later described the scene. It was like striking a match to dry tinder. One moment they were a proud convoy. The next they were gone, smoke, flames, and men in the water. Here lies the lesson. Battles are not always decided by size, numbers, or tradition. Sometimes they are decided by the courage to try something different. The Battle of the Bismar Sea was more than a victory. It was a turning point. From that day on, Japan never again dared to send large troop convoys through those waters. And as the survivors clung to wreckage under the tropical sun, the balance of power in the Pacific had begun to shift. 8. The consequences. Strategic, psychological, and human. When the smoke cleared over the Bismar Sea, the scale of the disaster stunned even the Japanese high command. In a single day, they had lost 12 ships and more than 5,000 men. An entire convoy, one that had been expected to reinforce New Guinea and tilt the campaign in Japan's favor, was erased from existence. Strategically, the impact was immediate and irreversible. The Japanese could no longer risk large convoys in those waters. Every attempt to move troops across the open sea now carried the memory of March 3rd, 1943. Supplies and reinforcements trickled in smaller, fragmented groups, often under cover of night, but never again in mass. Without steady reinforcement, their garrisons in New Guinea withered. The empire that had once expanded like a tidal wave was now beginning to recede. Psychologically, the battle was a shock wave. For Japanese sailors and soldiers, the message was devastating. The sea lanes they once thought safe were no longer theirs. The enemy had found a way to strike with terrifying accuracy. For Allied airmen, the message was the opposite. For the first time in the Pacific, they had proof that air power alone could annihilate an enemy convoy. The failure and frustration of high-altitude bombing gave way to confidence. They now carried a weapon and a tactic that truly worked. And then, there was the human cost. Survivors of the convoy told harrowing stories of clinging to wreckage, watching comrades slip beneath the waves, or being strafed as they tried to reach safety. The Pacific, which once seemed like a protective moat for Japan's empire, had turned into a graveyard. One Japanese officer, captured later, admitted that the loss at the Bismar Sea was a turning point for morale. We realized then that our soldiers could not always reach the front. The ocean, once our shield, had become our enemy. On the Allied side, pilots and mechanics celebrated but quietly. Many remembered friends who had been lost in training or who had flown missions that failed before Gunn's innovations. They knew victory had come at a price, yet there was pride too. The knowledge that ingenuity and courage had changed the direction of a campaign. Here lies the lesson. In war, the greatest victories are not only measured by ships sunk or troops lost, but by the shift in confidence, in belief, in what each side thinks is possible. The Battle of the Bismar Sea broke Japan's faith in its convoys and restored the Allies' faith in their air power. And at the center of it all was the 8-gun nose, a desperate innovation born in a dusty hangar, carried by brave men into the teeth of danger. Its legacy, however, would extend far beyond one battle, for Pappy Gunn had not just built a weapon for 1943, he had set the blueprint for the gunships of the future. 9. Legacy of the 8-gun nose and Pappy Gunn. Long after the last ship slipped beneath the waves of the Bismar Sea, the echoes of that battle continued to shape the war. The 8-gun nose was no longer just a field modification, it became a symbol of American ingenuity, the kind of invention that turned frustration into power. Squadrons of B-25 gunships multiplied, their reputation spreading across the Pacific. To Allied crews, they were ship killers. To Japanese sailors, they were nightmares with wings. But the legacy stretched beyond 1943. In the decades to come, the very idea of strapping massive firepower onto an aircraft would evolve into something greater. The AC-47 Spooky of Vietnam, with its side-firing miniguns, and the fearsome AC-130 Spectre gunships of later wars, all carried the DNA of Pappy Gunn's bold experiment. The philosophy was the same: take what you have, adapt it, and make it overwhelming. For Gunn himself, the war was personal until the end. He continued to push boundaries, often clashing with officers who thought he was reckless or unorthodox. But his results spoke louder than any regulation. He showed that a 6th-grade dropout from Arkansas, armed with nothing more than determination and a mechanic's hands, could alter the trajectory of a global conflict. His family, once prisoners in Manila, survived the war. His children grew up knowing their father wasn't just a pilot, or a mechanic, or an airline founder. He was the man who helped turn the tide of the Pacific War with salvaged guns and impossible courage. Here lies the final lesson. True power in war doesn't always come from grand strategies or perfectly engineered machines. Sometimes it comes from individuals who refuse to accept defeat, who look at a failing system and say, there must be a better way. Pappy Gunn was one of those people. When the B-25 gunships roared into history, they carried more than bombs and bullets. They carried proof that innovation is the heartbeat of survival, that when traditions fail, imagination must step in, and that the courage to break rules can sometimes save nations. So the next time we think of turning points in World War II, let us remember not only the great generals and admirals, but also the man in the hangar, sleeves rolled up, welding a new kind of nose onto a tired bomber. Paul Pappy Gunn may not have worn stars on his shoulders, but his vision left a mark as bright as any on the battlefield. 8 guns, 15 minutes, a battle that shifted the Pacific and a legacy that still echoes in the skies today.